is a very proud recipient of the Illinois Humanities Grant, and tonight's program is one in a series of virtual programs funded in part by that grant. It is my honor and a great pleasure to be hosting tonight's discussion with Camille. I encourage you to buy her books, which are very easy to purchase at bookshop.org. Ryan, our Zoom jockey, will post the website in the chat, so you don't need to rush for a pencil and pen right now, or pencil and paper right now. It's bookshop.org. I encourage you to purchase them. They are fabulous. So a little background about Ms. Dungy first. Camille is the author of 4 collections of poetry: Trophic Cascade, published by Wesleyan University Press, 2017. Smith Blue, published by Southern Illinois University Press, 2011, which was the winner of the 2010 Crab Orchard Open Book Prize. Suck on the Marrow, Hen Press, 2010, winner of the American Book Award in 2010. And What to Eat, What to Drink, What to Leave for Poison by Hen Press, 2006. Her debut collection of personal essays, Guidebook to Relative Strangers, W.W. Norton, oops, you can't see that, 2017, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. As a working mother whose livelihood as a poet lecturer depended on travel, Camille crisscrossed America with her infant, then toddler, intensely aware of how they were seen, not just as a mother and child, but as Black women. The Kirkus Review noted of this lyrical memoir, quote, "Each essay flows smoothly into the next, and they are all interlinked with themes of race, fear, joy, and love, bringing readers eye to eye with the experience of being a Black female poet, lecturer, mother, and woman. Forthright, entertaining, often potent essays that successfully intertwine personal history and historical context regarding Black and white in America," unquote. Ms. Dungy is the editor of an anthology, Black Nature, 4 Centuries of African American Nature Poetry, the first anthology to focus on nature writing by African American poets. About this anthology, a book list starred review notes, quote, "Just as nature is too often defined as wilderness when, in fact, nature is everywhere we are, our nature poetry is too often defined by Anglo-American perspectives, even though poets of all backgrounds write about the living world. Ms. Dungy enlarges our understanding of the nexus between nature and culture and introduces a new way of thinking about nature writing and writing by Black Americans," unquote. Black Nature brings to the fore a neglected and vital means of considering poetry by African Americans and nature relating to poetry as a whole. Ms. Dungy serves as the poetry editor for Orion magazine. Oops, excuse me. She is also the editor of several other anthologies, including From the Fishouse, published by Persea, 2009, and Gathering Ground, a reader celebrating Cave Canem's first decade, published by University of Michigan Press, 2006. She is also the recipient of fellowships and grants from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Sustainable Arts Foundation, the Diane Middlebrook Residency Fellowship of the Gerasi Resident Artist Program, and other organizations. She was the recipient of a 2019 Guggenheim Fellowship. Her poems and essays have been published in Best American Poetry and the 100 Best African American Poems, nearly 30 other anthologies, and over 100 print and online journals. In 2019 Guggenheim Fellow, her honors include NEA fellowships in poetry and prose, an American Book Award, 2 double NAACP Image Award nominations, and 2 Hurston Wright Legacy Award nominations. Her poems have been published in Best American Poetry, the 100 Best African American Poems, and Pushcart Anthology, Best American Traveling Writing, and over 30 other anthologies. She is University Distinguished Professor at Colorado State University, but enough by me. We want to hear from you, Camille. I am so excited to have you here. Let's start the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, let's make it happen. Thank you so much for that introduction, Kristen, and for inviting me to share time with your community. I rather wish I were able to be with all of you in person. Today, I am a great lover of Chicagoland, but Kristen and I did rather decide that with your weather there and our weather here, that my flight would have gotten hung up in either Denver or O'Hare. And so it's probably best anyway that we're here and you all are cozy at home, safe and sound. And I do think that there are some real benefits to this brave new world we're experiencing, and to figure out what those are, one of them being nobody has to be outside in 2-degree weather. So I thought I would just read a few poems and talk a little bit about some of my ideas about the intersection between nature and poetry and human experiences and the greater than human world, and how those end up showing up in my writing, directly and indirectly, and sometimes consciously and not. So I thought I would start with a poem that talks about my grandmother, because part of the reason for my great love for Chicagoland is that my grandparents lived on the South Shore for nearly 40 years, and I would visit most summers. There's a section in my memoir, Guidebook to Relative Strangers, where I talk about how it was that I came to travel there all the time. And while this doesn't necessarily speak directly to some of our ideas about nature, in other ways it does. So let me just read this, a few paragraphs here. When she was 15, my mother kept watch over her own grandmother's body. She was the eldest granddaughter, and death watch was her duty. She sat alone overnight in the dead woman's parlor, the coffin open before her. My mother couldn't fathom raising children who didn't know about the fundamental trappings of death. These were, to her, part of what it meant to be alive. But she raised us in a manicured region of Southern California that tried to repudiate the existence of death. One story my mother tells is that she was driving with me down the 405 freeway near our home when we passed a hearse. I was 4 or 5, the age my daughter is now. She's not that age anymore. "What's that funny looking car?" I asked. And because she feared for my ignorance, and because she knew what we needed to learn, my mother began sending my sister and me to Chicago each summer. There, we accompanied my grandparents on hospital visits and to funerals. We also went to weddings and choir practice and meetings of the Women's Bible Study Guild. In short, we were fully involved in the life of the body of Original Providence Baptist Church. Well after noon on those summer Sundays, if there was no luncheon planned down at the church's gym, my grandfather, the head pastor of Original Providence, would remove his clerical collar and drive a few blocks for a bucket of church's fried chicken. We ate in his large pastoral study on the second floor of the old stone church. My grandmother didn't cook well. And I think my grandparents, who loved language to an immoderate measure, enjoyed the pun-rich pleasure of relying on churches after their long days at church. When we were done, let me correct that. Grandmother always said, people are finished, cakes are done. When the long days had finished, we drove from the west side back through the city and around the lake to my grandparents' brick home in a South Shore neighborhood known as Pill Hill. And I think when I think of those summer days of what that trek meant from the South Shore of Chicago through and around underneath the library and the post office, and then to the west side and back, and the way that the landscape would change, the way that the lake would come to dominate everything for a while and then almost seem to disappear. How can such a giant body of water in some parts of the city be all you can see? And then other places, it's almost as if it's not there, except for the wind. Those ways that you can be really directly involved in and reacting to, responding to these parts of the environment that we might really clearly understand as nature. And then these other ways where you can pull away from it and live in almost complete isolation from it. I think that movement back and forth, and also the movement for me back and forth in my summers from the Southern California home to the Midwest, where things are very different in a lot of ways. The climate is different, the humidity factors are different. And then of course, there's these cultural differences, lake versus ocean, access to hills and mountains where I lived, and then the plains of Illinois. Those things always lived inside me and meant that I was kind of always paying attention to the landscape around me as it related to the people around me and the culture and the history and the details of the world where I lived. So that when I began writing, I think those kinds of things that I paid attention would just show up on the page. So here's that same woman again. This'll hurt me more. Don't make me send you outside to find a switch, my grandmother used to say. It was years before I had the nerve to ask her why switch was the word her anger reached for when she needed me to act a different way. Still, when I see some branches, wispy ones like willows, like lilacs, like the tan yellow forsythia before the brighter yellow buds, I think these would make perfect switches for a whipping. America, there is not a place I can wander inside you and not feel a little afraid. Did I ever tell you about that time I was 7, buckled into the back seat of the Volvo before buckles were a thing America required? My parents tried, despite everything, to keep us safe. It's funny. I remember the brown hills sloping toward the valley, a soft brown welcome I looked for other places, but found only there and in my grandmother's skin. Yes, I have just compared my grandmother's body to my childhood hills, America. I loved them both. They taught me each things I needed to learn. You have witnessed, America, how pleasant hillsides can quickly catch fire. My grandmother could be like that. But she protected me too. There were strawberry fields, wind guarded in that valley, tarped against the cold. America, you are good at taking care of what you value. Those silver gray tarps made the fields look like a pond I could skate on. As the policeman questioned my dad, I concentrated on the view outside the back window. America, have you ever noticed how well you stretch the imagination? This was Southern California. I'd lived there all my life and never even seen a frozen pond. But there I was in 70-degree weather, imagining my skates carving figure eights on a strawberry field. Of course, my father fit the description. The imagination can accommodate whoever might happen along. America, if you've seen a hillside quickly catch fire, you have also seen a river freeze over. The surface looking placid, though you know the water deep down, dark as my father, is pushing and pushing, still trying to get ahead. We were driving home, my father said. My wife and my daughters, we were just on our way home. I know you want to know what happened next, America. Did my dad make it safely home or not? Outside this window, lilac blooms show up like a rash decision the bush makes each spring. I haven't lived in Southern California for decades. A pond here killed a child we all knew. For years after that accident, as spring bloomed and ice thinned, my daughter remembered the child from her preschool. And now, it's not so much that she's forgotten, it's more that it seems she's never known that child as anything other than drowned. My grandmother didn't have an answer. A switch is what her mother called it, and her grandmother before her. She'd been gone from that part of America for over half a century, but still that Southern soil sprang up along the contours of her tongue. America, I'll tell you this much. I cannot understand the mind, where it reaches. Even when she was threatening to beat me, I like to imagine the swishing sound a branch would make as it whipped toward my body through the resisting air. She'd say, "This is hurting me more than it's hurting you." I didn't understand her then, but now I think I do. America, go find me a switch. Okay. So I feel like I need to make it clear. My grandmother was actually a very gentle woman. And yet that language and the ways that sometimes all you have to do is say, "Go get me a switch." And that's enough to make the change happen. And the way that then that sort of language makes the things out of which switches are made resonate in different ways. It makes you kind of see the world differently and feel the world differently as a result of the use to which we put the natural objects in the world. And I think, to me, that's one of the most interesting things about thinking about writing about the greater than human world is really thinking about nature in relation to man, not separate from our experiences, but really directly tied up with who we are and who we can be and who we have been. And the greater that connectivity, and the greater the ways that we can kind of really think about an entwined experience of the world, I think the greater our chances of living a truly sustainable life. I live in Colorado. I live in the American West, where there's this kind of vision of vastness and openness, and wilderness spaces where supposedly, to borrow the phrasing of the Wilderness Act of 1964, nature untrammeled by man. But we know at this point in the 21st century that there is no place untrammeled by man. In fact, that was all a myth. There never was a place untrammeled by man in North America. There have been humans living here for tens of thousands of years. And so that myth is fantasy at best, and dangerously racist in who and how it erases other lives. But also, what we understand now, the way that we live, we have to pay attention to places that are distant from us as much as we have to pay attention to places that are right there. So this next poem that I'm going to read is kind of follows one of these complicated places far away, places nearby, and an interchange, a connection between non-human lives and human lives, and what we might learn from that. One night in 1888, as the French steamboat Abdelkader powered from Marseille to Algiers, news reports proclaim the sky became quite black with swallows. The channel between one life and another has always been subject to sudden explosions. Those swallows must have been exhausted. The birds alighted in the thousands on the sails, ropes, and yards of the Abdelkader. I began with birds, thousands. Some wandered into cabins, ate from passengers' delighted hands. I will return to the birds, but you should know the Abdelkader was named for a man who died 5 years before they blacked the sky around the boat that bore his name. If you don't know how many died, how many more he saved in the decades of conflict between France and Algiers while Abdelkader was emir, maybe you won't know what a wonder this was to report. I read about it in the New York Times. This must have sounded in those days like the stories we hear now of cranes, white-napped, red-capped, who nest nowhere securely but along Korea's demilitarized zone. Those winged strangers remained all night on the vessel, the article claims. In the morning, fed and rested, they flew off for coastal islands still controlled by Spain, which, as you know, once kept as its own our neighbors, Honduras, El Salvador, Mexico. I've been trying to write about the Abdelkader swallows for more years than I am able to count. Yesterday, you apologized for arriving late for dinner. You'd seen a small, bent woman walking with heavy bags near the grocery store, and you stopped to ask if she would let you drive her home. You are the size of Black man people here consider frightening. The woman must have been exhausted. She settled her body in the cabin, and you carried her safely home. Some days, especially as I'm reminded of how we fight the animals we are, who need to migrate as much as we need to settle, to stay, how we'll tear apart and strand and starve and slaughter that part of us who takes flight from one place to some other. I try to recreate this, a rather curious episode in natural history occurred the other day. The story I love so much begins. So I'll read a couple more poems about our interconnections with others. These next two poems are from my book, Trophic Cascade. Characteristics of life. A fifth of animals without backbones could be at risk of extinction, say scientists. BBC Nature News. Ask me if I speak for the snail, and I will tell you, I speak for the snail. I speak of underneathedness and the welcome of mosses, of life that springs up, little lives that pull back and wait for a moment. I speak for the damselfly, water skeet, mollusk, the caterpillar, the beetle, the spider, the ant. I speak from the time before spinelessness was frowned upon. Ask me if I speak for the moon jelly. I will tell you one thing today and another tomorrow, and I will be as consistent as anything alive on this earth. I move as the currents move, with the breezes. What part of your nature drives you? You in your cubicle ought to understand me. I filter and filter and filter all day. Ask me if I speak for the nautilus, and I will be silent as the nautilus shell on a shelf. I can be beautiful and useless if that's all you know to ask of me. Ask me what I know of longing, and I will speak of distances between meadows of night blooming flowers. I will speak the impossible hope of the firefly. You, with the candle burning and only one chair at your table, must understand such wordless desire. To say it is mindless is missing the point. So I live out here in the wild, crazy American West, which is like, I just live in the suburbs. But there is this sort of vision of the American West that is easy to foster. Right now, there's an interesting, pretty regular news story going on because there is a wolf pack, the parents of which relatively recently migrated across the border from Wyoming into Colorado. And they are now resident wolves in Colorado for the first time in many, many years. And we also just recently had a ballot measure that decided that wildlife would release more wolves into the state. And so there's this kind of ongoing question of what will that look like in the rangeland, and what will it look like if wolves end up in more inhabited areas? What are the ways that wolves will change the landscape? Which is a question I have long been interested in. Here's the title poem for this book, Trophic Cascade. After the reintroduction of gray wolves to Yellowstone, and as anticipated, their culling of deer, trees grew beyond the deer stunt of the mid-century. In their upreach, songbirds nested, who scattered seed for underbrush, and in that cover warrened snowshoe hare. Weasel and water shrew returned, also vole, and came soon hawk and falcon, bald eagle, kestrel, and with them hawk shadow, falcon shadow. Eagle shade and kestrel shade haunted newly buried runnels, where mule deer no longer rummaged, cautious as they were now of being surprised by wolves. Berries brought bear, while undergrowth and willows growing now right down to the river brought beavers who dam. Muskrats came to the dams and tadpoles. Came to the night song of the fathers of tadpoles. With water striders, the dark gray American dipper bobbed in fresh pools of the river, and fish stayed. And the bear who fished also culled deer fawns, and to their kill scraps came vulture and coyote, long gone in the region until now. And there scattered seed and more trees, brush, and berries grew up along the river that had run straight and so flooded, but thus dammed, compelled to meander, is less prone to overrun. Don't you tell me this is not the same as my story. All this life, born from one hungry animal, this whole new landscape, the course of the river changed. I know this. I reintroduced myself to myself, this time a mother, after which nothing was ever the same. One of the things for me about becoming a mother was it was an experience where I actually really truly understood how much of an animal I am. I think there's a lot of ways in our world and our lives where we can ignore the fact that we are part of the animal kingdom, but there's not a lot more intensely mammalian as live birth and many of the other things that go along with it. And then having this kind of feral creature who you're responsible for raising and domesticating, essentially, changed pretty dramatically some of my thinking about separation after birth. The new mothers sleep always in their clothes, since all their doors have been opened, since they learned every room is part of every other room. The new mothers are just like the old mothers. Common as suburban deer, the new mothers see human faces, human faces, human faces, all these windows, every garden trampled, every feeder emptied to spite hunger, not as lovely as a bird's, and winter coming on. About time, the new mothers are cooperative. They measure months by the length of an arm, the proportion of leg muscle to belly fat. They will wait several weeks for a minute. The trees dropped their fruit and all of us were drawn to it. Was a time before when this field was wide and welcoming. Every door has been opened empty windows, empty windows, empty windows now are wombs. The new mothers live in the open, pacing the hours. About dreams, they are like animals, the new mothers. Mouths to feed and flanks to warm. Everything cleared out and winter coming on. So I'll just read a few more poems and then we'll have some conversation time. I have a series of poems in this collection called Frequently Asked Questions, which were questions that people asked me when I became a new mother. And part of playing with the form was an opportunity to play with some of my fears and things that kept me up at night. So before I read you a couple of those frequently asked questions, I'll read you a thing that woke me up at night. Brevity, as in 4 girls, Sunday dresses, bone, ash, bone, ash, bone, ash, bone. Frequently asked questions. Number 8, are you going to have another child? No. Frequently asked question number 9, don't you think you should have another child? This girl I have is hardtack and dried lime and reminds me every groggy morning what a miracle it must have been when outfitters learned to stock ship holds with that one long-lasting fruit. How the sailors' tongues landing on its bitter brilliance must have cursed the curse of joy as I did that morning the burst of water brought my sweet girl into our lives. But already she hates me sometimes. Like I have sometimes hated my mother, and she must have sometimes hated her own. After weeks at sea, the limes would desiccate and the meal fill with worms. They would have eaten anyway, the sailors, but taken no pleasure from anything, or taken no pleasure from anything but the fact of their sustained lives, which is to say, it is all I can do most days not to swallow her up and curse her maker, I swear, like I have not sworn since the morning she was born. Frequently asked question number 10. Do you see current events differently because you were raised by a Black father and are married to a Black man? I am surprised they haven't left already. Things have gotten downright frosty, nearly unbearable. A mob of them is apparently mouthing off outside when I put down my newspaper and we all gather to stand beside my daughter in the bay of kitchen windows. Quisculus quiscula. This name sounds like a spell, which after its casting will make things crumble into a complement of unanswerable questions. Though, if you need me to tell you God's honest truth, I know nothing but their common name the morning we watch them attack our feeder. I complain about the mess they leave, hulls I'll have to sweep up or ignore. My father, who I am thankful is still alive, says we could use a different kind of seed. A simple solution. We want that brown bird with the shock of red, the northern flicker. We want western bluebirds, more of the skittish finches. But mostly we get grackle, grackle, grackle all day long. They scoff all we offer, and being too close and too many, scare the other birds away. Still, can it be justifiable to revile these harbingers? My husband says, look at all those crackles. I almost laugh at him, but the winter air does look hurtful loud around the black flock. Like static is loud when it sticks sheets to sheets, so they crackle when pulled one from another and sting. My father, who is older now than his older brothers will ever be, promises he will solve the problem of the grackles and leaves the window to search for his keys. The dawn sky, blue breaking into blackness, is what I see feathering their bodies. The fence is gray, the feeder is gray, the aspen bark. Gray hulls litter the ground, but the grackles, their passerine claws, 3 facing forward, 1 turned back around the roost bar of the feeder, are so bright within their blackness, I pray they will stay. So one of the things about writing about these questions of connectivity and continuity is that sometimes I find myself returning to the same questions again and again. And so the second to last poem that I want to read returns to one of those poems that got me up at night. On brevity. My daughter's 3 months old. A nightmare rocks me awake, and then 14 words, brevity, as in 4 girls, Sunday dresses, bone, ash, bone, ash, bone. The end. 1963, but still burning. My darkening girl lies beside me, her tiny chest barely registering breath. Had they lived beyond that morning, all the other explosions shattering Birmingham, even some who called it home called it Birmingham. 3 of the girls would be 70, the other 67. Somebody's babies. The sentences I rescue from that nightmare, I make a poem. 4 names grayscaled at the bottom of the page: Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, Denise McNair. Revision is a struggle toward truth. In my book, I won't keep the end. For such terrible brevity, dear Black girls, sweet babies, there's been no end. And finally, I want to make sure to leave some time for our conversation. And I feel like I want to end with some light and joy and hope. So here will be my final poem. Language. Silence is one part of speech. The war cry of wind down a mountain pass, another. A stranger's voice echoing through lonely valleys. A lover's voice rising so close, it's your own tongue. These are keys to cipher. The way the high hawk's key unlocks the throat of the sky, while the coyote's yip knocks it shut. The way the aspen's bells conform to the breeze, while the rapid's drum defines resistance. Sage speaks with one voice, pinyon with another. rock, wind her hand and water her brush, spells and then scatters her demands. Some notes tear and pebble our paths. Some notes gather the bank we map our lives around. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Camille.
Thank you.
That was beautiful. I love language. I love all of your, I could listen to you for a long time. Your poetry on nature is just beautiful and so sensual. And of course, motherhood. I relate to all those so directly myself. I get all those emotions. I get it. Oh my goodness. Yeah, and all of your poems on connectivity. We do have a few questions though before I get into something I wanted to ask you specifically. We have someone here who said, "What inspired you to start writing poetry in the first place?"
Yeah, that's a great question. I honestly do not remember ever not writing. My mother says that I used to scribble poems and stories before I could actually write, you know?
Yeah, I
I'd be
believe
like,
it.
do a little scrawl and be like, I wrote a poem. My grandmother was a librarian at Mary Mapes Dodge Elementary School in Chicago. And like was of that generation where kids memorized poems and gave recitations. So in those summers in Chicago, I would have to memorize some poems and share them. And so that's kind of always been in me. Hold fast to dreams, for if dreams die, life is a broken winged bird that cannot fly. Hold fast to dreams, for if dreams go, life is a barren field covered with snow. Still in me, right? And so because I was around people who believed in literature, I kind of understood that was a thing that could be done. I was introduced, I actually met in person Gwendolyn Brooks when I was young. And so like I understood that poets were living people, not just like old dead people in books. And so it always just seemed it was a thing I loved to do, and it remained a viable thing. I was talking with a student today as she was trying to figure out what to do after she graduated. And she had two really very different paths to take. But as we talked it through, it was like, one, the doors were all open.
Yeah.
You know, one seemed like that was clear, like that was the path that she was meant to be taking right now. And as I said to her, you know, life is always hard, and life as an artist is particularly hard. So if paths are open for you, and it seems like things follow and you do them and you reward them and you keep doing it, go in that direction. And I feel that has been my story with writing. I mean, I just made it sound really nice and easy. I wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning every day right now to like get writing done before my day starts. Like that part isn't easy and hard. And but it just remains so important to me that I do that.
It is just you. It's beautiful. Now you mentioned Gwendolyn Brooks. What other poets have inspired you over the years?
Mm-hmm. Lucille Clifton is another one of my kind of,
Yep.
I just love her. I love her so much in so many ways. I also really love Robert Hass as a poet, and I find those two very interesting. I mean, they in some ways are like my first top two poets, and they're very different in every kind of way, demographically different, and stylistically different. Robert Hass's poems are long and sprawling, and Lucille's poems are really taut. She said that she wrote very short poems because that's how long her 5 children napped. And so like those two possibilities for what a poem can do, I think you may have heard that a little bit in my reading today, that I sometimes have these really, really short poems, and then sometimes is that a poem or an essay, right? That they can be really dense. And so I like those, I like to have those two possibilities available.
Yeah. Well, whether your poems are short or long, I have to say that each word is so intentional and so meaningful and just beautiful. It really evokes a lot of emotion, all of your writing. Do you have, now you mentioned getting up at 5 in the morning, which a lot of us do. Anyways, when the muse strikes you or whatever, do you have a certain process in creating poetry, or do you, like your nature poems, do you just sit and inhale and think about things, or how does it come to you, or what's your process?
Yeah. I think I can kind of overlap this with a question that I see in the chat, where somebody asked me if any of the English Romantic poets resonate with me, and the answer to that is that there's two, also for different reasons: Wordsworth and Blake. It's again Blake's compression and his like intense images, and then I just like Wordsworth's chattiness. Like he just like goes on long walks and just keeps talking to you about that walk. But it is that movement. It's that walking. So I'm a walker, and I watch, while I'm out walking, and I pay attention. I take a lot of notes. I keep a notebook. I'm just like, I'm always asking questions and seeing and trying to describe my sensory experience of the world as I move through it. But then Wordsworth says that poetry is emotion recollected in tranquility. And so there's that balance between that kind of moment of intense inspiration where you see things or you feel something very strongly, and then the way that it can be tempered in writing. And I think that time and that patience that can come from regular practice, it's easier to have that kind of patience if you're working regularly than if you're just waiting for the moment that inspiration strikes you. Because often inspiration strikes you at really inopportune moments, for one thing. And it's, inspiration can be disembodied in some kinds of ways. Like it gives you the thought, but not the body in which that thought needs to go. So in the poem about the Abdel Qadir ship where the swallows landed, and I said in that poem, I've been trying to write that poem for years. The true answer is I have been trying to write that poem for 17 years, 7 days and 4 hours. That's how long it took me to write that poem. 17 years of waiting. And then I went and I taught a writing workshop at the Minnesota Northwoods Writers Conference. And it was a generative writing workshop. And I asked people to bring drafts of poems that they were stuck on, that they just didn't know. And we did all kinds of activities to kind of open up that the doors into those poems. Among them, I actually brought scissors and tape and had them cutting up their poems, because sometimes we get stuck thinking something has to look a particular way. And really lovely poems came out of that experience. But I was teaching, I wasn't writing. I got home from that, and Amy Nasoka Matadal, who was then the poetry editor of Orion, wrote and said, I really want a poem. I need a poem from you, like by tomorrow. And I actually didn't have anything. And usually I would just say, no, I don't have anything. But I've been thinking about those swallows. And I look back at the passage from the New York Times that I had on my desktop for 17 years. And I cut it up for the first time. All the other times I had tried to put the whole quotation directly into a poem, and it hadn't worked. And so that sort of sense of emotion recollected in tranquility, or inspiration recollected in tranquility or distance, is really important to my process. I mean, I don't want my distance to usually have to be 17 years. Like, that's a particularly long amount of time. But also I love that permission that it gives me, that sometimes you could wait that long and figure out the answer.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
We just have another chat from Peachtree City, Georgia. I'm totally enjoying Ms. Dungy and her wonderful poems. Thank you for sharing. I agree. I'm totally enjoying. Thank you. While I'm enjoying your poems on nature and such, you do have a very serious side that you work. You are active in the 1619 project and restoring historical correctness. Oops, sorry about that. Lights went out in this office. Anyways, would you mind taking a minute or two at least to talk about the 1619 project and your involvement in that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the second poem on brevity was my contribution to the 1619 project. And one of the things to me that poetry allows is a reframing, or another way into imagination and the ways that we create the stories around us. And where that plays in with history is that poetry, creative writing of all kinds, give us opportunities to interrogate history, renew our awareness and connection with it, see history differently, but also see history as it connects to who we are and where we are now. When I went to college, I thought I didn't really like history. Like, I thought it was the subject I was least interested in. Which may have a little bit to do with the fact that by that time my sister had gone on to graduate school in history, and I was like, that's crazy. But it also had a lot to do with how history had been taught to me. And I very frequently felt like no connection. It was like I just didn't see myself in the stories that were told about American history, about Black American history, if that was told at all. And also, I often just didn't connect with how it was taught. Like, you had to memorize the dates, and you had to memorize the names, and like you had to memorize the names of the presidents in exact order. And like, it just, like, for what? Like, why? But then I got really into poetry that was written out of the Black arts movement, which I didn't know anything about because we didn't teach that. You didn't teach the like Black Power movement, 1970s stuff in school. So I didn't know anything about it. I just like was really interested in the poetry. And in order to understand the poetry, I had to read the history. And then I got really interested in the history. It was fascinating because now it was connected to stories that were interesting and literature that compelled me. And I realized, like, that's it. It's just packaging. And that I could be a historian, but from a different pathway. And so, like, circling all the way back to that question about the Romantics, like, I know things about that time in England because I want to understand what was happening in Blake's world and why he was writing these poems in the way that he's writing, right? So poetry became a gateway drug for me, for history. And I like to then create poetry that can pay back that favor for readers after me.
Thank you. Beautiful. Yeah. Well, Camille, unfortunately, our time is coming to a close.
Just like that. Boom.
Yeah, I know, just like that. Well, I've enjoyed every minute. Are there any more questions? Let me see if any have been sent under my door. Hold on. Nothing new, but I do want to thank you so much. It's been an honor to hear your poetry and to read your stories and your poems, your essays. They're also moving. Some are beautiful. And as I told you when I met you, some make me cry on brevity. And hearing the background and reading, it's very difficult reading, but very necessary. And I appreciate that you take the time to write it and help us all understand our history, our joint connected history.
Thank you. And thank you, all of you who spent this hour with me. I'm always grateful for people's time. I know there are so many things that we could be doing with our lives. And so I'm really honored that you chose to be with me for this hour.
Well, we're very honored to have you. Thank you. It was a wonderful way for us to spend our hour. And we wish you only the best. Thank you so much.
All right. Okay. Take care.
Take care. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.